So we're on page 78 of Touching a City. So I believe it's class 15 now, and I think we'll probably finish the mimer that we're in the middle of in this book. Right? Again, this is a book that is a compilation of the different talks and Hasidic discourses that the previous Rebbe spoke when he came to visit Chicago, and was recorded and translated, and it's in the book called Touching a City's Soul, the city soul referring to Chicago. And we're in the middle of the mimer that he delivered on the 7th of Shvat, and it's on page 78. We're in section 6, which is the last section of the mimer. So it could be, as I said last week, it could be a little mystical and kind of complex to sort of join now, meaning give yourself a little bit to marinate in the ideas and have a little patience with the material and with yourself, because if you're just starting now, you're being sort of dropped into the end of this mimer, which itself has been quite mystical and very fascinating. But it's okay if you don't understand everything all at once. Let the ideas marinate. Everyone will get something out of class, even if it's, not the full thing if you haven't been here the whole time. Also, there are recordings of the class, so if people want to catch up, I can email recordings out so that you can hear the beginning as well. But we're in section 6, so I'm going to start with a very small review of the concepts in the mimer, so we can get into this section, which we have been talking about in this section, or I should say even earlier. The ideas that we've been talking about are faith and belief, bitachon and emunah, mainly spending time on emunah, about belief and how we can sort of actualize it. It talked about the concept of Moshe Rabbeinu, of the leader of the generation, being able to help with that. And what we've really spent most of the time in the mimer talking about is this idea that faith, or really the idea of what's called histalkos or das, that a person needs to develop, which is a connection to all the learning and the ideas that come about when they're learning, and really specifically not just connecting to the learning on an intellectual level, but connecting to the godliness in the learning, and to the point where a person actually senses it. That's really what this is from the previous Rebbe. That's really what the previous Rebbe has been talking about, is sensing the godliness. It's a theme that's really consistent in a lot of his teachings, is the idea of actually sensing the godliness. When a person is learning, when a person is davening, just sensing the godliness in something. So what specifically in this section, which is again section 6, page 78, what we did so far in this section is this idea of Chachma and Bina, which we've been talking about, the 10 spheres, the soul powers, that Chachma and Bina, that there's one level of connection to a Torah idea, which is called seeing, and one level that's called hearing, where we're connecting intellectually, and a person can really connect intellectually without having that ability to sense it. So he talked about 2 different levels of souls, that there's a level of soul called the seed of man, and the level of soul that's called the seed of animal, and how the seed of man is the level of the soul which really connects and senses the godliness, and the level of the soul of animal is the level which really could understand on a very deep level a lot of the ideas, but isn't connecting in the same way as sensing the godliness or sensing God in their life. So those 2 distinctions, and then talked about this idea of seeing versus hearing, that seeing is something which creates a deeper connection than just hearing, and that even with that, there's different levels of seeing. There's, seeing where a person is really connecting, or just like seeing. So what this section has been talking about is this idea that the pasuk, and we talked about the idea that in Hasidus we take a pasuk, we take a verse from Torah, and we retranslate it basically on a deeper level. So this pasuk, which Adam yadas Chava, that Adam knew Chava, so that's gonna be the source for this mystical idea that Adam, which is man, represents this idea of Chachma, seeing, and Chava, the idea of woman, represents the idea of hearing, which we talk more about in other classes. Yadas Chava, that Adam knew Chava, which refers to the intimate marriage relationship that he knew her, that the idea of knowledge is the idea of connection, an intimate level. And so that's the soul power of das. The idea, the intimate relationship is the idea of das, and as well, the child that's formed, or I should say the offspring, whether it's a physical child or whether it's a spiritual light that's brought into the world as a result of that union, is the offspring of that relationship. So that idea of das is the idea of connection, and therefore it also is the idea of the connection between Chachma and Bina, which then gives birth to das, which eventually is going to give birth to the emotions, which is this idea of a deep connection to, in this case, what we're talking about is to the godliness and the sensing of God. So that's sort of where we're up to, and that either one Chachma or Bina by themselves is not enough to get to this level of sensing godliness, but they need to be connected to each other. So I'm just going to reread part of I'm going to reread a little bit, that this idea of Adam nu Chava alludes, on my computer, sorry, popping up, that Adam nu Chava alludes to the bonding of Chachma and Bina through das. That's the verse, right? We're retranslating. In terms of Avodah, in terms of spiritual service of Hashem, this signifies being connected to God with the deepest, innermost point of the heart through Bina, the contemplation and thought lying at the heart of his meditation. That it's through Bina, what we talked about last week a little bit, like the woman's knowledge is the knowledge of the heart, and the innermost level of the heart is this level called Ru'usa de Liba, which is not Chachma, not Bina, but more das. It's like an inner connection, an inner dimension of the heart is even a higher level than anything else. Even though in general we say usually the mind rules the heart, but the inner dimension of the heart is even above the mind. So it says, an enthusiastic arousal of the will of the heart. When there is that, then a person bonds with the concept he's contemplating to the extent that he's entirely engrossed in the concept with all of his bodily senses, this being an expression of das, and this causes the Chachma to fuse with Bina, meaning we're trying to get the two together, and we're trying to make them a unit together, and that's what happens when we really contemplate and connect deeply to the idea. This implies that the intensity of the person's meditation brings about a state in which Bina, normally only associated with hearing, gains the perception of Chachma, which is seeing, and when hearing and seeing bond together fully, then that becomes the innermost level of das. And the last line that we read last class was the next line, the das which bonds Chachma and Bina is called das Elyon, higher das. So in the spheres we reviewed last time, but I'll just review quickly again, that in the 10 spheros, which are also 10 soul powers, right? There's the 10 that start with Chachma, Bina, and Das, which are the intellectual soul powers. And then there's Chesed through Malchus, which are the emotional soul powers. But above everything is something called Keser, which is sometimes, and in this mimer, is called the upper Das, Das Elyon, the higher Das. Higher Das is above Chachma and Bina, and it's a surrounding soul power. And then there's lower Das, which is the result of Chachma and Bina. There's the Das that's above Chachma and Bina that helps them bond, and there's the Das below Chachma and Bina, which is the result of their bonding. So when a person meditates and tries to arouse this like a deep connection to Hashem, it fuses the seeing and the hearing. Like on a experiential level, it means a person senses godliness. On a mystical level, they're using a supernal soul power to help activate their internal soul powers. But like what they're experiencing is insight and understanding, right? Sight and hearing, insight and understanding, and a fusion of the two where the person feels very connected to the idea to the point where they actually sense something about God. That was a review. Was that any questions? I know it's not so simple. The information is not simple. And again, if you haven't heard the last few classes, it will help to listen to them. But was that at least a little bit clear before we go into the material?
Hi, this is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. We're on page 79.
Yeah,
Page 79.
Thank you. I've missed a couple.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay.
Thank you. Okay, 79. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
The positive is next week you'll start a new one. So from scratch, right?
Next week we're going to have a review, God willing. That will be really helpful to everyone, including myself. You know, I mean, it's like I love the reviews after, because we go point by point by point from a sheet of paper that just reviews it. It's like it puts everything into place. But are we like okay to go forward, or does somebody have a specific question? I know, again, if this is the first class, it's going to be a little harder to follow. That's okay. Give yourself time. Don't give up on the class yet. We'll get there. But so far, basically what we are saying is that in order to really develop, in order to serve God properly, I guess we could say, or as wholesomely as we can, we want to really develop this an ability to sense godliness in our lives. And that's going to be something that requires lots of effort, but it also is, as we're going to see, something that that Moshe Rabbeinu helps the Jewish people with. Like we get help from above and we get help from below. You know, we work and we also get help. Are there any questions, or just a little too hazy still? Okay, let's continue and we'll see how it goes. So we're on page 79 in the middle of the page. So again, these are technical jargon terms, and I'm going to always try to bring it into the experiential level. So we said that Das Elyon, this supernal Das, this level of connection that's above our intellect, we're basically connecting to God at a level even above intellect, helps fuse the different aspects of the intellect together so that we can also understand something. So okay, so however, there's also a facet of Das called Das Tachton, lower Das, which connects the intellect to the emotions, i.e. to the inner aspect of the emotions. So that idea, this line is really the end of this section of the mimer, meaning we're within each section of the mimer, there's like whole concepts and it goes on to the next concept. So even though we ended right before it last class, but because this idea is that idea that we had to discuss and we ran out of time. So we talked about how there's the level of Das that's called above the intellect and the level of Das below the intellect. And Das is always a connector, right? Remember, the intimate relationship between a husband and wife is the parable in the physical world for this idea of Das, where the person is connecting to somebody else on a very deep level, not just an intellectual level. And it's a whole experience connection. So that connection, that soul power helps the two parts of the intellect to connect to each other, the seeing part of the intellect and the understanding part of the intellect, and really sense the godliness. And it also helps the intellect connect to the emotions, right? Like we don't as people, we don't want, as servers of Hashem, as people who are trying our best to connect to Hashem and sense Hashem, we don't want our intellectual understanding to remain aloof from our experience of what we're learning about. We want our intellectual understanding of Torah, mitzvahs, whatever it is, to also be something that sort of like permeates the rest of our body, not just our head, right? that permeates and sort of flows into the rest of us so that we can experience it on an emotional level, on a practical level, right? Flows from our head to our heart to our hands, right? We want to be, like in medicine, there's like specialists, and then there's also holistic approaches that deal with the whole person, right? We want our service of Hashem to be like a whole person experience. We don't want it just to be an intellectual thing. I think we told the story already in this mimer and many times in other classes, right? About the ethics professor at Oxford who was getting onto the tube in London, and he jumped the turnstile. You have to put in a coin into the turnstile to get onto the tube. And he jumped how much are we talking about? Not a very expensive thing, right? It's not like he couldn't afford it or it was very expensive. He jumped the turnstile, he got onto the tube, he was arrested. So they said to him, "You're the ethics professor at Oxford University. Hello?" Like, what's going on? And he said, "My friend is the mathematics professor at Oxford University, but he's not a triangle." As if to say, okay, this is what I'm studying, this is what I teach, but that doesn't mean that I am ethical or like living those practices, right? So in Torah, we don't want that to be our experience. We don't want to be just like we're learning something and it remains in the realm of intellectual fodder and so forth, and it's like an academic thing. We want it to also permeate our emotions and our actions and the way we view the world and the way we view God and the way we view ourselves and the way we view other Jews, right? We want it to become an organic experience. So that happens through activating our das, like mechanically. How does that happen in the soul? By activating our das. Like we want to activate our das. That means our feeling, our connection to the material that we're that we're learning, so that we can actually sense it at some level in our lives. So das connects the two parts of the intellect to each other. It's a third aspect of the intellect, but it connects the two aspects of the intellect together from above the intellect, and then it also connects the intellect to the emotions going downward. So that's why it's above the head, sort of above the intellect and below the intellect. It's two different aspects, and it's a connector. It's always a connector, so that we're not severed heads walking around, where heads connected to bodies. How's that? Any questions or comments or thoughts or feelings or?
On the
Just
chart.
Don't give up yet, please, ladies. Don't give up.
I mean,
Yes.
on the chart where is the lower das? Is it Tiferet? Like I'm looking
No, it's das. Chachma bina das. It's the third of the intellectual.
So that's the lower das. The higher one is
Keser.
Keser.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure. These ideas also, the word I like to use is marinate. We just, like, these ideas are ideas that we have to marinate in. Like we hear it in this class, and then we go to another class, we have another class, like we hear these ideas from a lot of different perspectives, and slowly, they start to come together at some level. Look, they're always going to be essentially beyond us completely, right? Like we're mortal minds and these are godly ideas, but they are supposed to help us live better lives, more godly lives. So there's some level where we can connect to them and understand them, and we just keep on going. We just keep on trying to really understand and everything as best as we can as we go on. So as the review happens and we hear it more and more, and in a partial class in this context and in a maamarim class in that context, the ideas start to slowly seep in. Okay, so again, remember, this is the very end of the mimer, and at the end of the mimer, it starts to go back to the very beginning of the mimer to tie the ideas together. So we are starting to do that now in the mimer. So this is like the next subsection of section 6. So Moshe Rabbeinu's great strength, we're going back to Moshe now. Remember, at the beginning of the mimer, it talked about how Moshe was a different leader than anybody else, right? Hashem calls him in the Torah, Moshe, Moshe, without a comma, whereas the other leaders, Avram, Yaakov, when Hashem calls them, it's with a comma, and that comma signifies that the way that Moshe's soul is, or the way that the tzaddik soul who has a comma is in the heavenly realms is different than it is in the physical realms. But Moshe, when Hashem calls Moshe, there's no comma. It means the way that Moshe's soul is in the heavenly realms and its source and its root is the same as it is down here. Moshe's in a different category than everybody else, right? It says in the Torah, it says there was never a prophet like Moshe. Moshe's like in a category by himself. So Moshe's great strength is to be able to draw down das and impart it to the Jewish souls. One of the results of Moshe being Moshe is that he can help us to activate our das. Remember, on the simple level of Torah explanation, on the pshat level, right? The generation of the desert. How do we refer to the generation of the desert? We refer to them with a category, with a title that's Dar Dea, the generation of. We usually translate it as the generation of knowledge, because that was the generation that Hashem gave the Torah to, and they studied the Torah for 40 years in the desert. So we were called Dar Dea. That generation was called Dar Dea. That's in the regular revealed aspects of Torah, Gemara, and so on. Here in this mimer, it takes on a deeper significance. What's the deeper significance? Dar Dea, now we understand the word Dea is the same as Das. It's the same word in Hebrew, just a different form. So now we understand that was a generation of Das. It was a generation. Why was it a generation of Das? Because Moshe Rabbeinu was the leader of that generation, activated the people's Das. So he's able to activate our Das and impart it to the Jewish souls. Even, remember we talked about earlier in the Mimer, there's these two levels of souls. There's the level of the seed of man and the level of the seed of animal. We said the level of the seed of man are those who can sense godliness, and the level of the seed of animal are those who can understand godliness, and maybe at a very, very high level, but they haven't reached that level of sensing godliness. So what do we do with these people? And the Friedrich Rebbe says that's most of our generation. Most of us will fall into the category of seed of animal, the souls that are from the seed of animal. So Moshe Rabbeinu's great strength is to be able to draw down das and impart it to the Jewish souls, even those souls of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, which are referred to as Zera Behema. Even the level of souls that do not generally, on their own, are not able to sense godliness. Again, that's most of us. Moshe Rabbeinu can help draw down this das, this level of connection and sensing to the nation, so that they will have das, recognition and awareness of godliness, enabling them to fulfill the charges, know this day and know the God of your fathers. Again, in Hebrew, those words are V'yadaita hayom and Da es Elokei Avicha, which means, just a minute, which means this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to help us activate or connect to this das, which means he's going to help us to come to a knowledge of Hashem, which is a mitzvah. If a mitzvah in Torah, according to the Rambam, it's one of the mitzvahs, is to know that there is a God. So this, again, all the terminology is the same terminology, das. It's das, which literally just means to know, like we just translate it usually as knowing. But here in the Mimer, we understand that we're also adding another dimension. We're not just saying to know, we're saying to know and connect and to therefore begin to sense godliness. So Moshe Rabbeinu can help even those souls that are called the souls of the seed of animal to know God, meaning das elokei avicha, v'yadaita hayom, know this day that there is a God, which means to connect to God at this level of somewhat sensing. Okay, it's still going to be the souls of the seed of animal. There's still the souls of the seed of man who are on a higher level, but Moshe Rabbeinu, because of who he is, can also help every soul to be able to, at some level, activate this das that's within us, which means that we're going to be able to connect to Hashem at a deeper level. That's something that Moshe Rabbeinu can help us do. Yes, Simchos, your question.
Sorry if I spaced out and didn't hear this part, but I know you have Moshe Rabbeinu who did that, and then in the end, there would be Mashiach, I guess, who would probably also do that. But what about all the, can you hear me? Is my internet spotty? Oh, it's okay. Okay. What about like the Rebbeim? Like we always say like the Rebbe or the Frierdiker Rebbe, or did they have a level like that? Are we saying?
So it's gonna basically, not in this mimer, but in the Tanya and in other maamarim, it talks about this concept from the Zohar, which is pashtus the Maisha b'chol dara v'dara, that there's a spark of Maisha in every generation, and the leader of each generation is called the Maisha of that generation because they have the spark of Maisha, which enables them to be a leader of that generation. So
Yeah, I think
yes.
that's what I heard before. So okay. All right.
In
Thank you.
addition, every Jew has a connection to Moshe's neshama as well, and a piece of, so to speak, of Moshe's neshama. So we all are able to, like, through the Moshe of the generation, access that part of our neshama. It's going to talk about Mashiach though in this mimer in a few lines. Okay. So back into the text on page 80. This is the aspect of das that draws down chachma and fuses it with bina, so that one's meditation will have the quality of seeing as well. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu helps us to be able to draw down. You know, it's like instilling something on your computer, or maybe it's not even instilling. You know, like when you put in a new program, but it's not even that, because the program is in the hardware of the computer, but maybe you don't know how to access it, right? So we have to get somebody to, like, go in the search bar and you type in this, and then you find it in the application, and then you open the application, and then you pin it on your, you know, on the bottom of your, make a shortcut to it or something, so you don't have to constantly be searching it and trying to find it and opening it, right? So, like, it's like the Moshe Rabbeinu helps us, like, find the application and bring it out from, like, the recesses someplace in the hardware of the computer and pin it on the bottom toolbar, so that it's a tool that we can just click on all the time and use, basically. How can Moshe do this? Why is Moshe able to do this? This is possible because Moshe is the Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd, or the shepherd of faith, singular and unique among the 7 shepherds. So we talked about this again. These are terminologies that came up in the beginning of the Maimah, right? How Moshe is defined and discussed and given the title called Raya Mehemna from the Zohar, which can be translated in 2 ways. A faithful shepherd, which means he was faithful to the Jewish people, as we see throughout all the stories in the Torah, where Moshe was pleading on behalf of us and doing things for us even when we didn't really behave ourselves. And in addition, a second way to translate that is a shepherd of faith, that Moshe Rabbeinu shepherds faith. What does that mean? That he is like the master over this quality of faith, and he can help distribute it and activate it in the Jewish people. He's shepherding faith. He's a faithful shepherd to the Jewish people, and he's a shepherd of faith, helping to activate faith in the Jewish people. So what does that mean? This is the mean, for why is he called the shepherd of faith? For he nourishes and sustains the Jewish souls by endowing them with das, knowledge, right? He literally, on the literal level, how did he endow us with knowledge? Because he taught us Torah, right? That the generation, Moshe took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, obviously with Hashem, and gave us the Torah through Hashem, and taught us Torah for 40 years in the desert. So he gave us knowledge of God. Just literally, he gave us knowledge of God. But what we're saying here is, on a deeper level, he activated that quality and nourished the quality of this connection, this deep sensing of godliness, which comes from das, which is called faith. Because remember, the higher level of das is called das elyon, which another way of calling that is keser, which is the supernal soul power, which is where the seat of faith happens. It's above rational, it's supra-rational, and it's the seat of faith of the Jewish soul. So Moshe Rabbeinu gave us das literally by teaching us. On a deeper level, he activated the quality of das in our soul, enabling us to sense godliness through the connection between seeing and understanding, which is the concept of faith. So he like nourished our faith. Like it was there in potential. It's there in every single Jewish soul. It comes pre-programmed in the hardware of our soul, but it requires watering, pruning, sunlight, like anything else, right? And so that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was able to do. He nourishes the faith. Remember the example in the beginning of the maamarim was food and drink enables the soul and the body's connection to stay together. Well, in order to nourish the soul's connection with the soul powers, we also require the equivalent of food and drink, spiritual food and drink, learning, working on, davening, all these things that like nourishes our connection between our soul powers and our soul. So Moshe Rabbeinu does this, like through his teachings. So this is the meaning of Raya Mehemna. This is the meaning of one who nourishes faith. This is the leader who nourishes faith. This is what it means. For this, okay, that's the idea. That's another idea. Do we get that idea? That concept? Moshe is the one who helps us nourish faith. Yeah? Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Thank you, Simcha.
We have to go back to what's my favorite maamar of the Rebbe? Yes, because he talks about Moshe
I'll
being
take
the shepherd.
Malka's favorite maamarim for 400.
No, seriously, but that makes that maamar more clear.
Of course.
Learning the nuts and bolts of how it's actually done.
Correct.
Yeah, so funny, Chaya. That's exactly what this looks like, because all the little squares.
We'll pick a Jeopardy game.
Jeopardy game.
Okay. Okay, so for this reason, he was the first redeemer. Moshe was the first redeemer of the Jewish people from Egypt and will be the final redeemer, Mashiach. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean he literally is going to be the final redeemer because he's not from Malchus Bais David. But this idea of a Raya Mehemna, this quality of nourishing the faith of the Jewish people, that quality is imparted, right? That ability is imparted to the final redeemer as well, because that's what redemption means, basically. Because the meaning of a redeemer is that he endows the people with das. Remember our refrigerator magnets our refrigerators are completely covered now with all these quotes that we have to have in my maamarim in our refrigerator. But this is a biggie. The meaning of a redeemer is that he endows the people with das. In case people were wondering, how do we know who a redeemer is? A redeemer is somebody who endows us with das. Why? Because the redemption, the concept of redemption, the concept of geula is seeing beyond the physical limitations of something into its godly core. So somebody who helps activate our das is somebody who enables us to have a personal redemption. And somebody who activates enough people's das enables this redemption to happen on a national level, on a global level, right? Where a person's das is activated, it means they're sensing the inner godliness that is at the core of everything. That's the definition of a redeemer. What better definition of redemption is there? That's it. That's the whole definition of redemption. So is being able to connect to the inner godly dimension of everything. So somebody who enables somebody else to connect to the inner godly dimension of everything is a redeemer for that person. So Moshe Rabbeinu was the first redeemer. On a physical level, he took us out of Mitzrayim. That's a physical redemption that happens. He gave us the Torah. That's a spiritual redemption that happens. We don't see the world in the confines of the world. The world is no longer the master over us. And on an even deeper level, when we get to the ability to be able to sense godliness in everything that's happening, that's of complete redemption for personally, but that's not enough. We need it to happen globally for every Jew and every non-Jew, right? Mashiach is not just coming for the Jews, Mashiach is coming for the non-Jews as well. So it's like the world has to be saturated with these ideas, which goes back, of course, to the idea of the Baal Shem Tov, where he had what's called Aliyas HaNeshama, or his neshama had an elevation, and he asked the neshama of Mashiach, when are you coming? And Mashiach said, when your teachings have spread forth to the outside, that The whole world has to be aware of God, godliness, the inner dimension of godliness, morality, right? That's Mashiach for the world. There could be an individual righteous person could be living at the level of Mashiach. That doesn't help the world enough. It helps somewhat. It like each light brings more light, but we want the whole world to be elevated. So that's the definition of redemption. So somebody who is able to activate somebody else's das, I mean, obviously that person has to work on it themselves as well. It's not, somebody can't just do it for somebody else, but enables that person to be able to activate their das. That person is a redeemer. And so Moshe is the first redeemer. And then Moshe also represents this idea of the final redeemer with Mashiach, because he started that whole process towards redemption.
Chaya, just to bring it down to like our level, because it sounds so lofty, that reminds me of the story that your husband told. I'm sure a lot of people told it, of like the two maamarim walking somewhere. I don't know if it was Russia. They're walking through the street. They can't find any Jews anywhere. Like, you never know what's going to elevate someone or bring up that feeling in someone. And then years and years later, some woman was like up in an apartment and saw these random maamarim walking and like started taking on something in Judaism just because she saw these random maamarim walking through the streets. Like, you never know, like, what your action or just being somewhere, how that would activate, something in somebody else that helps them get closer to God. I don't know.
Yeah.
Any one of us, anywhere we are, can, not on the level of Moshe, obviously, but on some level, it's like that whole thing. If you know Aleph, teach Aleph. If you know, so in some level, I mean, all of us, like you say, we have a part of Moshe in us. So anywhere we are like the examples to all the other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Okay, ready to go on? Any other questions? Okay. When Moshe first, so page 81, top of page 81, when Moshe first spoke to them, communicating God's message to them, he said, and you shall know, v'yadaitem, that I am God, as the verse states in the beginning of Parashas Va'era. Meaning, again, it's not insignificant. In other words, it's not just a happenstance, like these happen to be the words. It happens to be the words, and you should know Hashem. No, it doesn't just happen to be. Moshe is connected to this idea of das. So that's what it says. The verse states that Moshe spoke accordingly to Bnei Yisrael. In other words, Hashem says, you shall know, and then Moshe spoke accordingly to Bnei Yisrael, meaning that you should know God, right? You, the Jewish people, should know God, and Moshe is going to help you know God. But prior to this, it is written, and the people believed that they possessed the aspect of faith alone. Thus, it was Moshe who endowed them with das, meaning this level of faith alone is not enough. We need it to be coupled with this idea of das, which is the connection. Remember, at the very beginning of the Maimer, we talked about, or rather in the middle of the Maimer, we talked about this idea that faith by itself is not enough, because faith by itself is a surrounding soul power. It's the das elyon has to be connected with das tachton. It's a surrounding soul power, which means that a person could believe in God, right? We gave the famous example that it gives in Chassidus of the thief who stands outside the home. He's about to burglarize, and he says, "Oh God, please help me be successful and not be caught," right? So the question is, what's going on over here? Like, if he believes in God, obviously he believes in God. He's asking God for help, that he should not be caught and he should be successful. He obviously believes in a God who hears prayers because he's praying to him. He obviously believes in a God who is involved in the details of the running of the world. Otherwise, why would he ask God for success? And yet he's asking God for success to go literally against his will. God says you should not steal, and he's stealing. So how is that consistent? And the answer is, it doesn't have to be consistent, because faith is a surrounding soul power. A person could have lots of faith in God, and still not have it affect their emotions and their actions. But we, like that ethics professor, that's not what we're looking for. It's not our goal. Could be sometimes there's a disconnect because maybe we're not at that level yet. We haven't worked on ourselves. We're not, we're still growing, whatever it is, but we're not trying to be inconsistent, right? We're trying to bridge the gap. So that's like that ethics professor, right? So the point is that Moshe is the one who helps us be endowed with, Moshe endowed them with das. This is the idea that we want to connect the faith. We want to internalize the faith. We don't want it to stay surrounding. That's why it's called nourishing. It's using like the parable of the idea of food, where food we actually eat. So we eat food, which means it sustains us and nourishes us on an internal level. He feeds us faith. That's like the parable, right? Moshe Rabbeinu feeds us faith. He nourishes the Jewish people's faith. He gives us so that we can internalize our faith. It's pre-programmed, it's in the Jewish soul, but sometimes it can remain on this like ethereal level. We want it to actually affect the way we think, the way we speak, the way we act, the way we feel. We want it to affect us. We want this faith to permeate us. Likewise, he will be the final Redeemer, Mashiach, when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God. Again, remember, this is not happenstance. The verse that it talks about from the prophets that describes what the world will be like when Mashiach comes is Maleh haaretz ideya es Hashem. The world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Now we have a deeper understanding of that verse too. It doesn't just mean knowledge like discrete bits of information. It means the sensing of godliness that comes from an activated das. The world will be filled with the knowledge of God and the sensing of godliness, right? I.e., the final redemption will also focus on the spreading of knowledge and the activation of das, right? All existence will be nullified and subservient to God because everyone will know me, that deep level of knowing that we talked about. So that's what's going to happen when Mashiach comes, right? That's why we just defined, right? This section was defining what does redemption mean? Redemption means the knowledge of God. That's what redemption means. Person is freed from the constraints of the physical things that, whether it's internal, their Yetzer Hara, or external, feeling that the world controls them. There's an inner connection to godliness and knowledge of God. Okay. Yes. Are we good to go? Okay, next. The difference between the redemption from Egypt and the final redemption, right? Moshe took us out of Egypt and Mashiach will take us out of this final exile. So what's the difference between the redemption from Egypt and the final redemption is that the level of das that was drawn down at the redemption from Egypt only related to the level of Mimali Ka'almin, the godly life force that enclosed itself within the worlds, each one according to its level. By contrast, the potential for das to relate to the level of Sovev Kal Almin, the transcendent aspect of godly light that encompasses all existence equally and does not adapt to the capacities of the recipients, will be manifest when Mashiach comes, may it be speedily in our days. So what is that saying? That's this idea that, right, there's another like definition that we're going to give, and then I'll reread that phrase. The definition is Memali Ka'alman and Sovev Ka'alman. These are two levels of godly light, which we have heard about in other contexts, but this is the first time we're hearing about it in this mimer. There's many different ways of like defining and organizing godly ideas and godly light and so on. This is one of them. Mimalik from the word malay, which means full, and Sovev Ka'alman comes from the word Sovev, encompassing. So again, I'm going to define it, but don't get too caught up in the terminology, like I feel like it's too overwhelming. We're going to just talk about it like a little bit on a practical level, right? So Mimali refers to the light that's called a permeating light of God. It fills a vessel. Sovev Ka'alman is a light of God that encompasses, it surrounds. Now, what does that mean? The parable, let's say that, like for example, What does it mean? It means there's a level of godly light that is contracted and condensed and contracted and condensed, and it gives everything its life force. It's almost like its soul, right? It's like it's activating life force. So a tree has a certain amount of godliness, and that level of God and that amount of godliness and type of godliness that gets funneled into it, after all the contractions and condensations, is what gives rise to a tree. And a plant has a different one, and an animal has a different one, and a human being has a different one, and a Jew has a different one. Everybody has a different level and sort of configuration of godly light. Imagine a vessel, right? Like this water bottle is filled with 16.9 fluid ounces, but if I had a bigger water bottle, it would have more water. If I had a smaller water, it would have smaller amounts of water. If it looked like a bowl, it would be a bowl filled with water instead of a water bottle, right? The light fills the vessel according to the capacity and style and size and shape of the vessel. So too, godly light fills different vessels differently, and that distinction is what creates the distinctions in the order of creation: inanimate, plant, animal, human kingdoms. There's different levels of godliness and so on. Then there's a level of godliness which is surrounding a vessel. It's like how we're, so to speak, suspended in godliness, where Hashem is called Hamakom, the place. Everything is suspended within godliness. It's sort of like, the something that's suspended in the ocean, right? As opposed to somebody who's drinking water, the water goes into them, as opposed to somebody who's like underneath the ocean, they're like the water is surrounding them. There's an aspect of God, and it's obviously not physically permeating or surrounding it. It's not, this is a parable, but the idea is that the godliness is bigger than the container, and the container is within the godliness. So what basically what we're saying here is that the level of das that Moshe brought down in the time of the redemption from Egypt was sort of like a lower level godliness, the level of das that filled the vessels, the godly force that enclosed itself within the world, each one according to its level. That means each of us has a different capacity, even on the human being level, right? Certain people have this amount that they can contain in their brain, certain people have this amount they can contain in their emotions, and each person is different. So there's infinite number of gradations of this level of godly light that fills the vessel, because each vessel is different. And sort of conceptually on a global level, the redemption of Egypt brought about godliness that filled the vessels, and we connected to it on the das level, but it was a lower level of godliness that we were connecting to on this das level. We were sensing godliness. What kind of godliness were we sensing? We were sensing the godliness that permeated the vessel. Whereas when Mashiach comes, the level of godliness, that the potential for das that we are going to have when Mashiach comes, is relating to the level of soivev kol amen, the transcendent aspect of godliness that encompasses all of existence. We're going to be able to sense the higher level of godliness. So again, we're still activating our das. Moshe Rabbeinu, the first Redeemer, is activating our das and feeding us the faith on an internal level. And we're connecting to Hashem and sensing God, but it's a lower level of God that we're sensing, versus when Mashiach comes, we're going to be also at that Redeemer, because redemption is the idea of sensing godliness and seeing the inner core of everything and not its shell. So, but we're going to be able to sense the higher level of godliness even. So that, like, we're not there yet. Mashiach didn't come yet. We're still in exile, right? But like this idea of the redemption, there's two sort of stages of redemption. There's the stage of redemption where we can sense and connect to the lower level of godliness, and then there's the stage, and that happened at the leaving of Mitzrayim and the giving of the Torah. And I guess through our Torah mitzvahs all these years, we have one aspect of the ability to sense and relate and connect to godliness. And then there's going to be a whole nother level of sensing, relating, understanding godliness that's going to happen when Mashiach comes. You had a question, Talia?
Does our avodah increase the capacity that can we increase our personal capacity through avodah?
Yes, that is what we're trying to do,
yeah,
right?
That's
Every
what I thought. I just want to make sure.
Do mitzvahs and everything else. So through the teachings of Moshe Rabbeinu, or the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation, we become more and more activated, I guess you could say, right? And through our mitzvahs and everything else, like our vessel grows and our understanding grows. But the capacity for this to happen happened at the leaving of Mitzrayim and the giving of the Torah and everything else that Moshe Rabbeinu did. And yeah. Okay. Okay, I don't know. Do people want to try to finish the mimer? I think we'll have to go overtime, probably 5 to 7 minutes in order to finish. Right now it's going to be like the summation of all the ideas in the mimer. This is the last section. It's going to go back to the first. Remember, mimer. You want to try? I think it's probably in our benefit to try, because otherwise we're going to start like the very end of the next class and have like, I think it might be beneficial. Let's see if we can. If people have an extra 5 minutes, let's see if we can do it. So again, I'm going to just say that in the beginning, remember, a mimer begins with a verse. I'm going to reread the verse from the beginning of the mimer. It always begins with a pasuk or a quote from the Gemara, which it then goes on to explain. Basically, a mimer is just an explanation of a pasuk in the Torah, believe it or not, or a quote from Gemara, right? So remember, this is the verse that we've been explaining. Trust in God and do good, dwell in the land and be nourished by your faith. We started with the difference between trust and faith a little bit, and then we went right into the faith. So trust in God and do good, we said that trusting in God and doing good are instructions, and the results are dwelling in the land and being nourished by our faith. That dwelling in our land and nourished by our faith, basically, also another way of explaining it is dwelling in the land and nourished by our faith are the idea of faith, and trusting in God and doing good are the idea of bitachon, as opposed to emunah. So now we're going to go, and we just spent a lot of time talking about that, and it looks like we went this way and zagged and zigged and zagged and zigged to get like back to this, but now we're going back to that original phrase, which, so we're saying that trusting in God and doing good, and dwelling in the land and being nourished by our faith. So we're saying that in order to act, we have to be nourished by our faith in order to activate our faith. That's kind of what we're getting at, what we've been getting at. So here now we're going to sum like the end of the mimer. So this is the meaning of trust in God, the opening verse of this mimer. The very first thing necessary is for a person to trust in God. That's the first like stage. And this trust must be expressed in action, not just in words, but in actual practice, which is why it says, trust in God and do good, right? As the verse states, and do good in actual practice. We don't just trust in God, we actually do something about that trust in God. It has to be expressed in action. We're doing good. By doing so, a person will be ensured a life of tranquility. Tranquility is in the eyes of the beholder, right? But they're even if they have difficulties in their life, this is a whole nother conversation, but even if they have difficulties in their life, but they're going to have a life of tranquility because they will have a life that's consistent with their values. That brings a measure of tranquility. Even if they have difficulties, we're not saying that people won't have objective difficulties in their life. This is exile, and most people don't have a completely problem-free existence, right? Like, let's just be honest. However, the trusting in God and doing good and dwelling in the land, be nourished by trusting God and doing good. It will. What is the previous Rebbe knows more than anybody else that the life is not problem-free, right? I'm saying he was incarcerated at a very young age as a child, and I think 11 times. Under the Tsar, under communism, he lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. He had escaped the Nazis, right? He arguably lived in the most treacherous century for Jewish people and experienced each of those issues on a personal level and in his family and with his Hasidim. So, and yet he's saying, if you trust in God and you do good, you'll have a tranquil life. What is that tranquility that he's talking about, right? A life that's consistent, our values and our actions and our beliefs, and it's all consistent. That brings a measure of tranquility, even if there are issues that have to be dealt with on a, and the food of faith that nourishes and sustains faith, right? Because it says, dwell in the land and be nourished by your faith. That's the end of that pasuk. So what does it mean, the food of faith that nourishes and sustains faith? Is the das that attaches a person to the subject of his thoughts and brings the matter close to him, like we've been talking about today in the last few classes, that the food of faith means that is das. It means activating our das, which means being connected to this idea. All Jews naturally love the Torah and its mitzvahs and rejoice and are happy in the study of Torah and fulfilling the mitzvahs and fulfill the mitzvahs. Similarly, look, that bears being repeated. All Jews naturally love the Torah and its mitzvahs and rejoice and are happy to study Torah and fulfill the mitzvahs. That's the natural state of the Jew. Maybe they don't know it because their das hasn't been activated, their faith hasn't been nourished, right? But that is the natural state of the Jew. So we need to activate the das and nourish the faith so they know it, but that's the natural state of the Jew. Similarly, all Jews are also similarly, all Jews also naturally despise transgressions and are God-fearing. That's the natural state of the Jew. Again, something could cover that over. Just because something is the natural state doesn't mean it's been activated. A person could be a natural whatever artist, but maybe that hasn't been nurtured, right? So it's latent. So all Jews naturally despise transgressions and are God-fearing. But this is all based on the intellect and understanding of the Torah. That's one level. Whereas the purpose of das is to become aware of the holiness of the Torah, the holiness invested in the Torah, meaning even a person who love Torah and want to do mitzvahs and despise transgressions and are God-fearing, this could be a from Jew also, not from whatever it is, but the Rebbe says, this could be somebody who's serving God with the intellect and the understanding of Torah, and that's not enough. It's not enough to just rejoice and be happy in the study of Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs and despise transgressing, because it's not through the learning of Torah. Because the purpose of das is to become aware of the holiness of the Torah, the holiness invested in the Torah. We don't just want to learn Torah as an intellectual study. We want to be able to sense the inner godliness in the study. As in the analogy mentioned above, das draws close a good matter in which that person rejoices and is happy, or arouses great fear and apprehension in a person's heart regarding an evil matter. In other words, they sense the good in the good and they sense the evil in the evil. And so they feel connected and happy to do the good, and they feel apprehensive to do the evil because they're sensing the inner godliness, or God forbid, the inner dimension that's going against godliness in whatever the issue is. So too, by means of das, great joy is produced by fulfilling mitzvahs, right? There's great joy in doing mitzvahs because the person feels connected to Hashem. And das also arouses great fear in the person, causing him to become afraid of sin. Why is he afraid of sin? He doesn't want to lose that connection to Hashem. A sin is disconnecting him to Hashem. He doesn't want to lose that connection, right? The das enables the person to not just do mitzvahs by rote or even by intellectual enthusiasm or intellectual inspiration is the word I was looking for, right? When a person's das is activated, they sense the inner godliness in the mitzvah, they sense the inner disconnect in the Aveira. And it's all about the connection to God, right? Adam knew Chava, his wife. We're talking about an example of, the Jewish people are sort of married to Hashem, right? It says that the giving of the Torah was like a marriage between the Jewish people and Hashem. So when we're doing Torah mitzvahs, it's like we're connecting to Hashem. So when our das is activated, it means that we sense the inner godliness in the mitzvah, and so doing a mitzvah creates great joy. We sense the inner, evil in the Aveira, so we don't. The doing of an Aveira creates we don't want to do it. This is what is meant by das being the food of faith that nourishes and sustains faith. This is what we mean when we say that by activating our das, it nurtures our faith. It nurtures and nourishes our faith because it enables us to internalize that awareness of godliness and to sense it so that we will do a mitzvah and we won't do an Aveira. And Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who enables us to activate that das. He's the person, and then the Moshe Rabbeinu in each generation is the one who is able, it feeds us our das, because the teacher of the, basically he's the teacher of the Torah, consummate teacher of the Torah, the inner dimension of Torah, and teaches us to connect to the godliness of the Torah, not just the intellectual of the Torah. And that helps us to sense the godliness in our davening, not just the rote of the davening, right? Like we're trying to get at the inner dimension, the sensing of godliness through all the rituals and intellectual study. Once we sense that, our service of God is completely different than it would be otherwise. And that concludes the mimer, actually. But actually, just like they say this is not the end, this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning, because now we need to take those ideas of the mimer and be like, well, now what do I do with that? Because that's the whole point of the mimer, is like, let's not just understand it, but now, like, okay, now what? Like, okay, now I want to try to sense the godliness in the mimer and see if I can bring that into my life. So Chassidus, learning Chassidus, specifically learning Chassidus, is a discipline which is rigorous intellectually and emotionally, meaning it talks to both the mind and the heart. So it by itself is something that activates our das. It's an activator of das, which is the idea that the leader of the generation is the one who feeds us this ability, as an activator, as a catalyst for our das to be activated through his teachings. That's what it's, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, through that generation, the Moshe of every generation, becomes a catalyst for us to be able to activate this idea. So that's a little bit about the idea of das and faith and service of Hashem, and that's the mimer that the first mimer that the previous Rebbe said in Chicago, 1942, which I guess was the message that he wanted to impart to the people of Chicago, which, even if you don't live in Chicago, and I know not every single person on this call is living in Chicago, but it's a message for Chicago, it's a message for the world, is this idea of activating our das. What I would like to do next class, like I said, is as a review. I'll have a review sheet and I'll probably share screen it, and we'll go through it. But I think what would be also very nice, hopefully everybody has the book, or if you don't have the book, maybe you can get it by next week. But if people are, whoever is comfortable, I should say, to like review as much as you can, and maybe highlight one idea that really spoke to you, and we'll go through the review, and hopefully we'll have time also after the, I'll hope that it won't take the whole hour, and maybe it'll take 40 minutes, let's say, or half an hour, something like that, to do the review. And then the last half of the class can be, people can share which idea of the mimer did they especially connect to, did they find compelling, some idea, because I think that is what we want to do with this mimer. Like we want to connect to at least one idea in the mimer, and then if we share it with each other, then we can all help each other. Anybody who's comfortable. I know if you're not comfortable, that's fine. You could listen, but I'm saying if you're comfortable to do that, then that will also, I think, be very nice to do that in the next class. Are there any questions? And I went kind of over. I hope that was okay. But I think it was better to finish this than, hopefully.
Chaya, can you email your outline to us so that when we're going through the review, we actually have the text in front of us. We can review it now.
Oh, you're saying email before class so that you,
yes,
not just to share screen it, you're saying?
Yes, please.
Malka just took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great minds, Joni. What do you expect?
Okay,
Yeah.
I just a disclaimer. I don't know when that review will be finished, so it might just check it right before class in case it comes late at night, Monday night.
All right. Okay. Hey, thank you.
Yes.
Could you do mine
I put the link
individually?
for the book.
Oh, still not getting the emails?
Yeah, I don't get them. So if you do mine individually, I'll get them.
I will do my best to remember, yes, God willing.
And Chaya,
I know, too much to remember.
No, I just feel badly for you. Like, it's just a shame. Yeah.
Bobby, I could send it to you when I get it.
I'm
Can't
gonna
I?
end the recording now, I think. Whoever's
Okay.
listening doesn't need to hear all this.